Drive Casual. Today we are talking about what was wrong with The Last Jedi. I'm Jesse.
I'm Ryan, and we're going to try to keep this video to around 15 to 20 minutes, but this is a very, very loaded topic, and I don't know that you can cover this topic within 15 minutes. But as far as The Last Jedi goes, there's a lot of different things that we can get into on this, but what we're going to start with is, at least for me, is the tone of the movies. Specifically, the sense of humor that's injected into the new movies as it regards to the last ones. Yeah. So, just as a classic example, if you look at The Last Jedi, and again, this is The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, but if you look at The Last Jedi, when Finn does his little call to Hux, I don't know what this is. The problem is that I feel like they're injecting a sense of humor into parts of the movie where it really doesn't belong.
I would agree with that. It's not like any other kind of Star Wars humor we've seen before. Not saying that all Star Wars humor has been spot on or great, but it just felt like such a major departure, something a little bit too millennial, and not something generic enough to kind of fit in the Star Wars universe.
I think one good way to look at it is when Luke is fighting Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back, and Luke kind of has his one-liner where he'll say, "You're fine, I'm full of surprises." It's a smart, quippy line, but it doesn't interject it at the expense of his antagonist. And it's one of those things to where if you look at something to where Hux is talking to Poe Dameron, he completely makes a fool of Hux. It takes a bad guy that's supposed to be somewhat scary, and it makes him look like a joke, and it kind of does it at the expense of the villain and actually being scared of the villain.
Which is something we'll probably cover in a little bit about the bad guys in the new Star Wars series really not being scary at all, particularly Hux or Kylo Ren.
Yeah. Now, keep in mind, what we're talking about isn't really isolated to The Last Jedi or The Force Awakens or even all of Star Wars itself. If you look back to the prequels, you can kind of start to see this trend where they're making the movies more modern and trying to inject more modern-day humor, but I feel like the new movies, specifically Last Jedi and even Force Awakens, kind of take this idea to a whole new level as far as injecting humor kind of at the expense of the moment. Another classic example of this is when Luke Skywalker is handed his lightsaber, or his father's lightsaber, and as a cheap throwaway gag, he throws the lightsaber behind him. I mean, this was an instance where people were literally waiting years to see what would happen next, and just as a throwaway joke, they say, well, it would be funny if we just have him toss the lightsaber behind it, and that kind of symbolizes another problem with The Last Jedi. It's completely subverting expectations with the golden surprise people, even if it's at the expense of the movie.
Yeah, so overall, the tone of the movies just, it almost feels like Star Wars is not taking itself seriously, or Disney is not taking Star Wars seriously.
They're taking something and they're trying to inject humor, and I think a lot of that comes from the idea of the Marvel movies have been such a big success, and they've had a great success of being this slapstick comedy, one-liner, gotcha kind of humor, and I feel like they're doing it at the expense of the villains, and they're really not keeping in spirit with the original tone of the original Star Wars. There were certainly funny instances in the original Star Wars, but it never felt like a wink and a nod to the audience. And I feel like a lot of what's going on in today's Star Wars is very, very much a wink and a nod. Look how clever we are. Look how many one-liners we can come up with. Where the original Star Wars felt a lot more adult. It felt a lot more. It took itself seriously a lot more, and I think that paid off, and that's why one of the reasons the movies have aged so well.
We could probably blame Guardians of the Galaxy for this, and I love Guardians of the Galaxy. I thought they were both great movies, but you can see what kind of a turn all the subsequent Marvel movies took after Guardians of the Galaxy came out. They continually have become more and more goofy, except for maybe the last Avengers movie, but even Thor was always like the most serious of the movies. It felt like the least amount of humor, and like Thor Ragnarok was just, it was as Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah, and here's the thing, that might work for Marvel. It might work for Marvel. Marvel is not an established franchise that's been going on for decades, where Star Wars is.
Cinematically.
Yeah, cinematically. Star Wars is. We've seen Star Wars movies in the classics. I don't think you need to age them. I don't think we need to say, well, we're making a Star Wars movie for today, so they should have a different feel and tone the originals did. Especially when you're talking about the Skywalker saga. This is one continuous saga. It's 3 trilogies of movies, and I think when you watch them from beginning to end, they should have the same tone. They should have the same feel. They should feel like one entire saga because they are. And I think just because there's a couple decades between each series, you don't actually need to make it feel different or modern or updated. It needs to keep the same feel. It needs to keep the same tone. And again, I think injecting humor and cheap laughs wherever you can is never going to be a great, long-lasting version. One thing that's really classic about the original Star Wars movies is I feel like they age very, very well.
Yep, they do.
So, getting away from humor, what's another thing that you feel like The Last Jedi was really, really divisive on, or in essence broke Star Wars?
Honestly, it felt like there was no respect for the source material. It felt like it was not made by Star Wars fans, or very few Star Wars fans had any role in the decision-making process, whether that was in the script or the directing. It felt like somebody who had seen Star Wars once or twice and then decided they wanted to capitalize on what it was.
Either that or someone who wanted to really take a departure from what it was. Maybe they knew what it was and they didn't really care for it. I think a lot of this is seen as choices that you see in characters. So a classic example of this is Luke Skywalker. Okay, now keeping in mind, Darth Vader was a mass genocidal murderer. He single-handedly went down and hunted the Jedi Knights that survived Order 66. He killed the younglings as Anakin Skywalker moments after being converted to the dark side. Killed a lot of sand people, which, not a big deal. But again,
nobody misses them.
His entire deal of the entire deal of Star Wars is how horrible, homicidal Darth Vader was. Now, keep in mind, this is the character that Luke Skywalker famously said, "I cannot kill my own father." Now, fast forward to The Last Jedi. Luke says he senses darkness within Kylo Ren, and in an effort to prevent him from becoming another Darth Vader, nearly kills his nephew, his sister's son, in his sleep.
Can't do my father, but we'll get my nephew.
Yeah, it just seems like such a huge departure from the most hopeful character in the series, killing his own nephew for what he might do down the road. It just doesn't seem character consistent.
No, and just his overall bitterness towards the Jedi, or towards himself even, it doesn't jive well with who Luke Skywalker is. Luke was a hero, and he was a hero before he even started. He was, a whiny brat, but he was still a hero. Like, that was in his heart, was to help people, was to save people, was to do his part to help the galaxy and fight against the Empire.
Another character that is really, really mistreated, in my opinion, and this, in all fairness, kind of started in The Force Awakens, was Han Solo. Han Solo kind of went through this arc as a character where he goes from being a very, very selfish, look-out-for-myself smuggler into being a rebellion hero, to being someone who cares more about others than himself. Now, again, this is the person who did not care about himself when he got frozen in carbonite. He was more concerned about Leia, which kind of harkens back to that famous line, "I love you," and he responds, "I know." In other words, it doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what I feel, I'm more worried about you, and his last words before being frozen are to Chewbacca saying, "You need to take care of her." Now, fast forward, he becomes a deadbeat dad, he leaves the rebellion because he can't deal with his failures as a father. Again, you're taking original trilogy characters and extremely misusing them.
Yep.
Do you think that they handled Leia well?
I think so. I think it felt like Leia for the most part, especially in The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi, honestly, we didn't see a whole lot of Leia.
Yeah.
And what I saw of her, I found to be believable, notwithstanding the Force pulling herself in from vacuum.
Leia had her Mary Poppins scene, which is divisive.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't have a problem with the Leia Mary Poppins scene until Rian Johnson went back and explained the Mary Poppins scene. I always felt like it kind of harkened to the idea that, hey, maybe Luke trained Leia in the ways of the Force. Maybe she had some Force abilities that Luke kind of honed in her as far as this space resurrection. And Rain Johnson comes out earlier and says, "Oh no, that was just a reflex. Leia's never had any Force training. That was just simply a reflex to pull herself into the ship after a huge explosion that didn't kill her."
Well, and that's kind of what's happening with the Force in general with the newer movies, is the Force is being cheapened. It's become something that anybody can do, and anybody can have a relatively high mastery of it in a matter of minutes if they feel really strongly about it. You know, like if they're in a high intensity emotional situation, they can just summon enough Force power to be able to pull themselves out of space, or to be able to fight a trained Sith or equivalent in Kylo Ren.
And we're kind of getting into this third aspect of what's wrong. From character building, we're going on to disrespect for the mythology of Star Wars, and essentially having the Force be somewhat of an easy button for characters that we like.
Yep.
Okay, you have Kylo Ren, who theoretically trained from the age of a small child in the ways of the Force. He is supposed to be the most talented Force user probably in the galaxy, being an era of Anakin Skywalker. And then you get to Rey, who has no training at all, has no strong heritage to where we can say, well, she just has a very, very latent ability in the Force. Keeping in mind, Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker from a young age did not have a command of those items like she does. Even sometimes in their later training, like if you look at Luke Skywalker in the Ice Cave and pulling a lightsaber from the snow, he trained for years to do this between Episode 4 and Episode 5.
In the original trilogy and even in the prequels, the Force was almost treated as its own character. Like it was another character in the movie, another casted character, because the way it was treated was almost as if, almost as if it had its own will, it had its own thoughts, and they've even talked about the will of the Force. But in the newer series, it feels like it's just this infinite source of power to push the plot along in the direction that they want to push it.
Mm-hmm.
If you pay attention, you'll find a lot of inanimate objects or non-anthropomorphic characters in other series, like in Star Trek. The Enterprise is almost its own character. And I'm not talking about the the computer that runs it, but just it's treated as its own character. It's written as if it's its own character. Whether or not it actually has any sentience, that's not the point. It's just the Enterprise is not a source of infinite power. It's got limitations. It's got restrictions. It's got rules. And so the Force has restrictions. It has rules, except until we get to The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. There are no rules. You can apparently fly in space, which okay, I really don't have as big of a problem with that. But you don't have to train for it. That's my biggest problem, is that this Rey, who is nobody, apparently,
had no training,
has amazing mastery to be able to take on highly trained enemies and win. Like she won against Kylo Ren with zero training. What even is that?
And yes, he was shot in the hip. Yes, but again, this is somebody who's trained their entire life, who's known of their Force instinct their entire life. And again, it's easy to compare Rey to Luke. Okay, Luke trained for years in between Episode 4 and Episode 5, and he was struggling to lift rocks while being trained by Yoda himself. He was struggling to lift the ship. There was legitimate hardship in his character development, and Rey just seems to have an easy button. It's, I need to mind trick a stormtrooper to get out of here. Never having done it before, mind tricks a stormtrooper.
Did she even know it was possible?
I don't know if it was like a rumor or something, or they had heard those tricks in legend or something like that. But again, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think it's a huge disrespect to the mythology, and it runs along with the idea that every single character that they're creating, especially the new characters, seem to be somewhat, again, I know everybody said it before, it seems to be a Mary Sue. None of these characters are having to go through training. They're never having to go through hardship. Another example would be Poe Dameron. I love the character of Poe Dameron, but it's like someone said at some point, well, Luke and Han, they were good at piloting, right? So in order to make people like Poe, we need to make him amazing. It was in The Force Awakens, and again, I like The Force Awakens, but he downs what, 12 or 15 TIE fighters within a course of like 9 seconds.
Yep.
It's just absolutely ridiculous. You never see characters going through hardship, pain, or strife. When it comes to their abilities, they just naturally, magically show up. And they're trying to give this idea of anybody can do great things. Anybody can do great things, but these things are not earned. These talents they have are not developed over a period of time or even given any explanation of why they exist. They're simply there as an easy button to make ourselves feel cool. It's like a child who's writing these characters and saying, well, I want to be the hero, and wouldn't it be great if I just did this with no training? Or wouldn't it be great if I could just down 17 TIE fighters within the course of 5 seconds? Oh yeah, that would be awesome. And they do those things expecting people to really, really like these characters just because they're overpowered.
And there was no real setup for why he had that skill. Like, even with Han Solo, like, he was introduced in such a way that you kind of understood that he had a background of being an awesome pilot. Even lines like, well, this is the ship that made the Kessel Run in how many parsecs?
12.
12 parsecs. And it's like, okay, well, we know that the ship itself didn't make the trip in 12 parsecs. We know that it had an amazing pilot as well. So we understand that, oh, okay, so he's a really good pilot. He's not just a pilot. And okay, it's a really cool ship, but it's not just a ship. Speaking of not inanimate objects that are its own character.
Yeah, Star Wars has done that better than anybody. The Millennium Falcon from day one has always been treated as its own character. It was treated with its own mythology. And shows like Firefly capitalized on that, showing that in Serenity.
Yep.
Okay? You can give life to these inanimate objects. You know, people are almost excited to see the Millennium Falcon as they are Han Solo, and that's not because it's just a cool ship. It's because it's the Millennium Falcon. It's a ship that has personality and quirks and things like that. So again, just as a recap, we're talking. So as far as The Last Jedi goes, we're talking about how the character's been handled poorly. There's no respect for the mythology at all. Just a really, really awkward sense of tone in the movie. And one other thing I want to talk about is the villains. The villains in Star Wars have always been scary. Whether you're talking about Darth Vader and the Emperor in the original, Boba Fett, these are all villains that have had their own sense of terror. Okay, Tarkin was a great example. Yep. Not a physically imposing character, but he was cold and he was ruthless and he was cool and calculated.
Yep.
Okay, fast forward to the current generation. I mean, and again, even if you look at the prequels, the Emperor was scary. Darth Maul was absolutely scary. Dooku had his own sense of terror. I do think they really, really misstepped when you're talking about the droids.
Yep.
Okay, the original prequel droids were kind of a slapstick comedy, and I think that's kind of where we get some of this.
Yeah.
But I could almost put up with that because those are the grunts. Those are the things that are essentially fodder for Jedi.
Right.
Okay, they're kind of a comic relief because no droid's going to take out a Jedi.
Even then, with the destroyer droids, they were still imposing and terrifying.
Yes.
And they didn't have any slapstick or anything like that. But from what I can remember.
But fast forward to the current trilogy. Fast forward to the Rey, Poe, Finn trilogy. And your main villains, which are Snoke, which again was imposing,
yep.
But then they killed him off. And then you have Hux and Kylo. Kylo was very, very imposing in his first scene in Force Awakens, but he quickly devolves into this temper tantrum throwing child who seems to have no sense of control, no sense of self-awareness. He's just a petulant child who is talented with a lightsaber and just insists on destroying command consoles every single time he gets the chance.
Which would have been fine, except that he was, at that point it was fine because he was taking orders from the imposing bad guy. He wasn't responsible for carrying the weight of being the bad guy in this series.
Yeah.
That was Snoke. Well, in The Last Jedi, they managed to kill the most imposing, the most important looking bad guy, and then make a fool of Hux and make a fool of Kylo.
The remaining villains that we have in this series simply are not scary. They're simply not imposing. And it's really, really easy to go back and look at many other series. When you don't have an imposing villain, the series suffers. It doesn't matter how good the actor, how good the good guys are. If they don't have a serious imposing villain, it just doesn't work. The reason The Dark Knight was so amazing was because Heath Ledger embodied the Joker. He did an amazing job. The reason the original Star Wars were good was Darth Vader. Darth Vader was a dramatically imposing villain. The Emperor was legitimately scary. These were huge big bads that we love to root against, but they kind of filled us with terror when we saw them on the screen.
Yep.
And Hux and Kylo just have no way to do that or embody that.
And then they had another character in Captain Phasma, which
Yeah.
had some potential to be a terrifying character, but then
Or interesting.
But then ended up getting kind of like Boba Fett.
Yeah.
But then ended up getting almost zero screen time in The Force Awakens, and then they died at the end of a regrettable story arc.
She was beaten by the sanitation trooper.
Right. at the end of The Last Jedi. So, so who are we supposed to fear now? I think the big bad guy in the next one is going to have to be Kathleen Kennedy.
Yeah, and again, we're going to get into this in a later video, but I don't know where they go from here. I think one possibility would be to demonstrate that maybe Snoke is still alive.
Yep.
Maybe it was a force trick, something like what Luke did, something to that effect. There have been theories to where Snoke looks much older in The Force Awakens on a hologram than he does in person in The Last Jedi. And maybe they can kind of weasel that into where, oh yeah, he's actually still alive. That was just a force projection, something that's similar that Luke did.
It could be also that Snoke is part of a much larger group, or at least maybe not a much larger group, but Snoke is maybe only one side of a coin, and there could be another.
But it's no doubt that the Star Wars franchise is in trouble. They have a trouble where they don't have any legitimate bad guys that are scary. They have a problem to where every single main character that they have, whether it be Rey, whether it be Rey, Finn, or Poe, are just as likable as they are, and they are likable. As likable as they are, they just haven't earned their merit.
Right.
Okay, they haven't had any character development at all. They were interesting characters in The Force Awakens, but there was no character development that took place during The Last Jedi.
He might have had some character development. He had those moments where he was trying to run away and trying to abandon, and then.
But that's exactly where he was in the first movie. Which,
Right.
Granted, this is another problem. I really think it was a huge mistake to not have there be a time jump between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. I think that's one of the key staples of Star Wars, is where you see Luke and you see Han in one place in A New Hope, and then you see them grow as characters between that movie and The Empire Strikes Back. And most definitely you see Luke grow between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. There's character development that takes place off screen, and it's implied that these characters have gone through hardships, they've lost people. Whereas in The Last Jedi picks up exactly where The Force Awakens leaves off, and it doesn't allow any kind of time. How cool would it have been to see Finn struggle to recuperate after Kylo Ren essentially opened up his bag?
Yeah.
To go through and have this kind of PTSD kind of an idea where he took a while to recuperate. Where Poe has essentially lost people, and maybe there's not hardly anybody left of his fighter squadron, and he's having a hard time dealing with the losses that he's taken as a leader.
Yep.
I mean, these are all things that would have been awesome to see, or at least allude to in The Last Jedi. But what we did was we saw Rey go through maybe, 48 hours of training, which wasn't really training. She never has to go through any hardship. We didn't even get a training montage to really legitimize why she was so good.
We could theorize that maybe she spent a couple weeks in the Millennium Falcon on her way to see Luke. Maybe that's how long it took to get there.
Yeah,
But a couple weeks, seriously.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's just really sad to see Lucasfilm and Disney really not use the same treatment and care that they are using in the Marvel movies. And I think that's one of the biggest problems as we kind of close out this video. I think the biggest problem with the series as a whole is the lack of cohesive theory. When George Lucas helmed Star Wars, again, not a perfect guy, terrible writer of dialogue, okay? But he had one cohesive vision. Yep. Doesn't mean he had it all figured out, but when he started, he had a very good idea of where he wanted to go. Where this one has really acted like a baton race. J.J. Abrams started, Rian Johnson receives the baton and, try to go a completely different direction.
Yep, and it shows. Not having a clear direction. I mean, you work with any team, and if that team doesn't have a clear direction and everybody's going in different directions, then the whole vision falls apart. Or if you don't have a vision guiding you, then or if you have a bad vision guiding you, whatever could be guiding the movies, we won't talk about that, but it's not working. And I think that the problem is, you know, Disney will look at the sales of the Last Jedi and they'll see that, oh well, it did really, really well at the box office, all things considered. But that's because people were expecting great things from it. Solo did not do well at the box office and that's because of The Last Jedi. Because The Last Jedi ruined our expectations for Star Wars, and therefore Solo really suffered.
I mean, you can be hypercritical of any movie, okay? I think the prequels were far from perfect. Even the originals were not perfect movies. But every single Star Wars movie I've ever seen had one thing in common, and that's when the final credits rolled, I was excited to see more Star Wars.
Yep.
I was excited there were new things to explore. The Last Jedi was the first Star Wars movie I've ever seen in my life to where I saw the ending credits and I just thought, I'm done. I don't want to see anything else. You know, if I have to wait 5 years to see another Star Wars movie, so be it. It just didn't make you excited. And again, the lack of cohesiveness is extremely apparent. J.J. Abrams set up plot lines in The Force Awakens, such as Rey's parentage. It was teased as this huge, huge thing. And again, she turns out to be a nobody with Rian Johnson. Snoke is really, really shown to be the big bad, but we never get any explanation as to who he was, what his motives were, where he came from, because Rian Johnson just decided to kill him off.
Yep, I think it's like we can't win with it.
You have to have a cohesive vision.
And I don't know how they fix it in 9.
And we're going to talk about different things they can do to fix it. We're going to talk about different options they may have. But at the end of the day, you have to recognize that Star Wars is broken. And The Last Jedi broke it. And what you do from here on out is ultimately up to Disney. But hopefully they start listening to the fans and realize that there have been some missteps taken. And I can't imagine that at the end of the day, Disney wants to essentially drain and trash their, $4 billion investment?
$4 billion investment.
Well, this has been Drive Casual. We appreciate you watching. Please hit that like button, that subscribe button, and we will see you next time.
And click the bell for notifications.
Absolutely. Thank you.